China is far and away the most significant challenge the United States has ever faced and probably will ever face in the future. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues affecting life and society. My name is Crispin, and following on with our series on the recent speeches on US foreign policy towards China and the declaration effectively of the new Cold War, I want to explain why America's challenge with China is far more serious, far more expansive, and more risky and more dangerous than any challenge it has ever faced before in its history. And this is none of what I'm about to say to indicate that America shouldn't do this. It should do this, but I feel a sense of moral obligation to tell people what is to come in the decades ahead, and the scale of the struggle, and the fact that at the end of it, we may even lose. Okay, we should do this, but let's be sober about it. So there's a lot of claims that, once America gets its act together, it can face down any challenge. No, that is not factually true. It has faced down every challenge in the past, but that's because those challenges were quite distinct from this one. So in every competitor of the United States throughout its history, except for when it was first declared independence, every challenge since then, the US has come into it as the more powerful nation. So against Germany in World War I, they were already the largest economy in the world. They came into the war once Germany had largely exhausted itself. In World War II, the US came into the conflict several years into the war again, and at this point, it was a major, major power able to defeat Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany at the same time. At the end of that war, it accounted for 25% of the world's GDP, vastly greater than the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union never competed with the United States economically. In fact, China's economy is vastly greater relative to the United States than the Soviet Union ever was. And the growth potential of America's competitors was never close to that of the Soviet Union. So take Japan in the 80s and the 90s, where a lot of people were saying that Japan was going to overtake the US economically. That was never going to happen. Japan has less than half the population of the United States. It means that every individual Japanese worker had to produce several times as much as an American worker, not even withstanding their massively aging population, declining birth rates. It was never possible. Whereas China is in a completely unprecedented category of 20% of the world's population, 1.5 billion people, where every individual worker just has to produce 1/5 as much as that of an American worker in order for the US economy to be second to China's. And China is already coming through this extraordinarily well. They did better in the global financial crisis. And now they're coming out as the first major economy to grow during this pandemic. So we're going to come out of this where China is the number one economy in the world. And this never happens, with any degree of frequency in history. America's economy became the number one economy around 1870. Everyone's grandfather basically remembers a time only when the United States was the most powerful country on earth. Before that, it was Great Britain. And then 60 years before that, it was China. And then before that, it was the Roman Empire. Like, we are talking very rare changes, okay? And so the US has not faced a challenge of this magnitude. And when people say, well, it's just like the Cold War, the Americans will pull through, let's examine how they entered that struggle, okay? At that time, Western Europe had been completely destroyed, as had Eastern Europe. As I said, America's economy was 25% of the world's GDP. And all sides kind of quickly unified to resist the hegemony of the Soviet Union in Western Europe, right? So it was easy to create NATO, whereby you had a military alliance of Western liberal democracies, all geographically located close together, wherein, Germany, France, the United States, they're all on the same page with the same collective enemy. Whereas in Asia, you've got thousands and thousands of miles and kilometers between Japan, India, Australia, like vastly different thresholds of interest. I'll give you one example. Australia had always wanted a good relationship between the US and China, right? It was always a fantasy, but that was what Australia saw as its interest, that it could continue to trade with China and continue to have a strong military alliance with the United States. Japan always wanted the opposite. They did not want China and the United States to be too close, because that was a threat to Japanese interests. So Japan welcomes this new Cold War, and Australia is tentatively trying to navigate it. So these interests are quite divergent, these thresholds to conflict. You're never going to get South Korea to ally with Japan against China. I mean, that is just a complete misreading of many centuries of history, right? Ever since the Imjin War of the 16th century, there's no chance that Korea is going to ally with Japan. It's just, this has come up multiple times in history. It's just not possible. And with India, yes, India has its own problems with China. There are some structural issues. There's the border conflict. There's China's support for Pakistan. There's China's increasing growth in the Indian Ocean. But there's also 1,800 years of relations and intercourse between China and India. They have their own systems and structures set up. They both see themselves and each other as massive and great civilizations. India pursues an India-first policy. It's not like West Germany, where it's completely occupied by American forces and they can just, basically assume that they will support American policy in Western Europe. India has its own game to play. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't cooperate with India. We should. But this notion that we're going to create this new Pan-Asian alliance like NATO is just total fantasy. That is not going to happen, but it is American policy. And I just think Americans need to... And the reason this policy exists is because, it worked during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. We'll just transfer it to the 21st century against China. That is just not a thing, right? It's not going to work. The economic relations is completely different. Now, one of the great things about the speeches, and I won't cover it here because I'll cover it in a future episode, was looking at American companies and its relationship with China. Well, with the Soviet Union, these trade relations never took place. We're starting this new Cold War from before the start line, right? The first struggle is at the home front, dealing with our own companies who are completely kowtowing to the Chinese Communist Party and have gotten rich off that largesse and frankly, double standard and hypocrisy. That we need to unwind all of that, and that's going to take significant amount of time and effort with a higher financial cost, more so to us than for China. And meanwhile, China will continue to grow. Now, I like to think that American companies and Western companies will ultimately become patriotic and take the long view. That's my hope and belief. But that's going to take time. And that wasn't the case in the Cold War, right, against the Soviet Union. If we think about the level of American confidence, at the end of the Second World War, the US went through decades of economic boom. It wasn't until like the 1970s that it had a significant economic downturn as a consequence of the oil shock. Right now, over 50 million Americans since March have claimed unemployment benefits. That is the entire working age population of New York State, California, and Florida combined, right? It's just an unimaginable figure, right? And then the pandemic, at the time of this recording, millions and millions of people in the United States have been confirmed as infected with the virus, and there is considerable anxiety and fear persisting throughout the entire country. Whereas when they entered the Cold War against the Soviet Union, the US had just defeated Nazism and you had photos of Douglas MacArthur standing next to the Emperor of Japan, right? The US was the dominant player and a confidence player, able to do things like the Berlin airlift. Stalin blockades this, Berlin with the hope of pushing the Western allies out. And America, combined with its allies, creates this airlift that brings in more supplies into Berlin by plane than was brought in by rail in the months preceding it, humiliating the Soviet Union. This kind of strength, capacity, ingenuity, drive, and partnership between the companies and the state. These are things that America could rely on in its struggle with the Soviet Union, and is unable to do so versus China. China has its own confidence and its own strength and its own depth of resources and a partnership, an inappropriate partnership, one might add, between the state and companies. So this is a different ball game. We're not coming to this as the stronger player. On paper, there are certainly some advantages, right? But the momentum is with China, and we're entering this struggle against a state which not only has the momentum, but much more upward potential. And the other thing is that, the Soviet Union was an experiment from 1917 onwards, basically adapting a philosophy that was born out of Western industrial economies and applying it to a peasant-based serfdom state that was Russia, and then industrializing. Whereas in China, historically, they have been a very powerful state, and they're re-emerging to what they perceive as a natural, long-standing norm, right? So from their point of view, the reason why China was weak was because of colonial powers carving them up, and that this is just them reasserting themselves in terms to how things were historically. And from their point of view, America is this kind of curious blip in their long own history. So they take a much longer view than the Soviet Union ever did. So China can be much more prophylactic in its strategy than the Soviet Union was. And so they're going to make smarter decisions than the Soviet Union did. So we've got a nation of enormous size, incredible upward potential, a time where America and the West is going through a huge crisis of confidence as well as an actual genuine existential crisis, and a China with a unified sense of itself, willing to take the long view. So let's be real about this. This is what we are asking our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren to assert Western ideals of liberalism and democracy and human rights and individual sovereignty and freedom of speech. And I think we will. Okay, I actually genuinely believe that. I think that we will, ultimately, be the narrative that inherits the earth. But that confidence is not born of my intellect. That confidence is born of my sense of myself and my sense of what human nature is, and the strength of our ideals and ideas. I think that is it's better than the Sinocentric narrative. But that's just my belief. That is completely distinct from my analysis. Okay, and one of the things that keeps coming up, less so now, but in years past, is people never really seem to know what side I was on. They were like, well, which side are you on, US or China? Because I was always, very critical of both sides, and not really sort of planting my flag and saying, I'm for this side. Well, now I am. I'm for the side of the West, and this is largely born of these speeches where I'm confident that America actually does have the commitment to do this, and if they do have that commitment, then they have my support. But historically, this has been an often criticism. They're like, well, we don't know where Crispin sits. And the reason for this is because I have a clear analysis of the situation. It's not because I want China to win. I absolutely don't. I think it would be incredibly dark for the world for us to go back to a Sinocentric world order in which the ideas of Western liberalization and sovereignty of the individual and freedom of speech and human rights wasn't the norm. If we went to that world, then we're asking our future generations to inherit a darker version of human life. and a limitation on our potential, which I'm unwilling to do. But my strategic analysis is that China has a lot of strengths, and if my job was to make China the world's dominant power, if I was in the Politburo or I was in the center of the main think tanks, I'd have a degree of confidence that I could achieve this outcome. And so what we need is an equally powerful strategy that we're willing to stick to over a long period of time, which is what my book will do and lay that out. Which I'm redoubling my efforts to finish. It's a balance. I absolutely cannot rush it because it needs to be right. It needs to be something that lasts the test of decades. But also, it can't wait too long because I think America is making some significant errors. Some correct decisions, but some significant errors that if we get too far down that line, it's going to be even further to call back. And the reason why those errors are being made is twofold. One, a lack of understanding about the magnitude of the China challenge, I think, is creating a sense of hubris. And two, drawing too much on the lessons of the Soviet Union and adapting that too directly to China's strategy. That is not going to work. It's a different thing, and we need to apply its own unique approach. So that's me kind of just trying to put that sober warning at the beginning of this struggle that we're standing at the precipice. And I think we should proceed, but we need to proceed with our eyes open. So if you found value in this conversation, please do like and subscribe. It helps grow the channel. Leave your own comment about where you see the century going and what I've laid out in terms of the major challenges. We will address them in our weekend review. And thanks for tuning in. And we'll review the American government speeches in the future episodes. Thank you.